Any budget bill contains a broad range of provisions that will improve economic outcomes for Canadians.
Contains a broad range of provisions. I didn't think I'd see him quoting Stephen Harper on the floor last.
The opposition benches erupted with cries of hypocrisy this week after the government tabled its sweeping budget implementation bill. Opposition members say the nearly 300-page document is textbook omnibus legislation, something the Liberals vowed to do away with during the 2015 campaign. To wit, here's the quote, Stephen Harper has used omnibus bills to prevent Parliament from properly reviewing and debating his proposals. We will change the House of Commons standing orders to bring an end to this undemocratic process. So is the government being hypocritical? The Liberals, of course, say no. What do our panelists say? And why is the opposition getting worked up about the issue anyway? We're back with round two of the Sunday Scrum. Susan Riley and John Ibbotson both join us from Ottawa. And I guess we'll begin with this bill, 294 pages. Jim Flaherty bill was 443. One got up to 880. But still, what is the opposition on about here, Susan?
Well, I think they're right. I think they have a point. This is, as I think the Globe and Mail called it, omnibus light. So it's not quite as broad-ranging as some of the Harper bills. But at core, it's got the same basic fault, which is that you're expected to vote as an MP on a whole range of things, yes or no. You don't get to separate out the things you don't like and vote no on them, perhaps. And these things are not strictly related. A lot of the measures have to do with the recent budget, which was passed, normal, they all fit together. But the ones that are really jarring to the opposition, and I think rightly so, the Parliamentary Budget Officer. You remember, we all remember Kevin Page, who was kind of like Sheila Fraser, the champion of the people. He was supposed to be independent. That office was supposed to be independent, and he was supposed to be able to go after, find out how much things really cost, not just what government says they cost, say they might cost. Anyway, there's a number of changes to that setup within this bill. Some of them are quite controversial and negative, and they should be dealt with separately. We'll see if the government pays attention.
Okay, well, here's a little more of that exchange between the NDP's Nathan Cullen and the Prime Minister in question period. Let's have a listen.
Not so long ago, the man from Papineau said this about omnibus bills, and I quote, "I wouldn't use them, period." Well, that seems pretty clear. And he also said, "The kitchen sink approach here to me is a real worry." Yeah, me too. Yet the Prime Minister has just dropped a 300-page omnibus bill on Canadians. So my question for the Prime Minister is, whatever happened to that guy from Papineau?
Any budget bill contains a broad range of provisions that will improve economic outcomes for Canadians, will touch on a broad range of issues because Canadians want to know that their government is dealing with the broad scope of the challenges that Canadians are facing on the economic level. That's exactly why we're proud of all the elements in this budget that are being put forward to help the middle class and those working hard to join it.
It almost appears as if the Prime Minister himself is trying to stifle a smile at this. John, in your column this week, you seem to have some sympathy for Mr. Cullen's point of view. Why?
Well, because it's an omnibus bill. Now, that's all there is, plain and simple. There's stuff in that bill that is not directly related to the budget, but is being put into the bill so that it will get passed without, a tremendous amount of scrutiny, and that makes it an omnibus bill. Now, look, Gerald Butts, the Prime Minister's principal secretary, took me to the woodshed on Facebook and said, this is nothing like what Jim Flaherty and Stephen Harper were doing in their last government. And he has half a point. It isn't as big as the big bills that the Conservatives rammed through. But it's still an omnibus bill in word and deed. And by the way, it reflects something else that's going on inside Parliament. When was the last time Parliament passed a major piece of legislation? It's been a very long time. And some of the stuff that you think Parliament has passed actually hasn't been passed. It's sitting in the Senate, where it's languishing under Conservative delaying tactics. The government is actually not doing a very good job of getting its agenda through. It's allowing itself to be stymied by opposition tactics in the House and then opposition tactics in the Senate. And I suspect the government is starting to get frustrated. And one of the things that governments do when they get frustrated is they start piling legislation into omnibus bills, sticking it in front of Parliament and say up or down, you have to vote for it, and if you don't vote for it, we'll have an election because it's a confidence motion. The next thing we may well see is time allocation and closure, as the Liberals decide that they're running out of time in their first government, if it is indeed only their first government, and they've got to get this stuff passed.
Yeah. You know, sometimes the government can just bulldozer its way through the usual traditions on Parliament Hill, and people don't care. I think that might be a case in point with their proposals to reform question period and to reform some of the parliamentary, the way Parliament works. There was a little kerfuffle about that, as you would call, within the last 2 weeks. I don't think that would have much resonance with regular people. This one could. It's really easy to understand. A government trying to sort of bully through some unpopular measures under the guise of this, you know, under this very broad umbrella. So there are at least two elements, the Parliamentary Budget Office being one, and the other one is the government wants to set up a Canadian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And again, that is such a, it's novel, first of all, and it's complicated, and it deserves separate study. So I think the opposition in this case the public is going to be behind them. And there's a lot of people with memories of Stephen Harper's heavy foot too, and his very heavy-handed ways. I just want to say one more thing when I was watching Nathan Cullen in that particular clip. The NDP and the Conservatives are both searching for new leaders, and the best possible leaders that both parties have are in the House right now. That would be Nathan Cullen and Rona Ambrose. So anyway, just as an aside. Okay, well, you brought up the PBO, so let's move on to the next section here, and that bill makes changes to how the country's budget watchdog does things. It was also a campaign promise to make the Parliamentary Budget Office more independent. Among the changes being proposed, let's have a look. The Parliamentary Budget Officer would have a full independent officer of Parliament. The bill would set the officer's term at 7 years. And unlike now, there would have to be a cause to remove the PBO. And the office would soon be able to publicly cost out election promises made by all parties, much as is seen in the United States. But the legislation would also require the office to submit its work plans for approval by the speakers of both the House and the Senate. And that's not sitting well with the man who's done the job, Kevin Page. Have a listen.
You know, I think it comes down to, like, is this legislation even better than what we have right now? And you can make the case that it's not better. On the one hand, you're giving independence, you know, you're a separate office, you're a deputy head, you get dismissed by cause. But on the other hand, saying you may not be able to do the stuff that really matters. So I think, like, fundamentally, the legislation is not written in a way. It's certainly not written in the way, like, you know, that's there for the Auditor General, or even for the, you know, Chief Executive Officer of the Infrastructure Bank, where they lay out the functions. I think it needs a rewrite.
Susan, I'm going to ask you both a double-barreled question on this one. Do you think the changes will likely make the PBO more or less effective, and do you think the public will care? I think the public should care, because I think this position really is a champion of the taxpayer. I think this is the idea. The whole idea is inspired by the Congressional Budget Office in the U.S., where these people take a hopefully objective view of big spending plans and say, wait a minute, you know, you've miscalculated here. This is going to cost way much more than you're saying there. It's a really valuable service, and it was introduced originally by Stephen Harper, too, by the way, who immediately then hobbled it. I think that there's real problems. I think on the one hand, it's good that it's going to be explicitly independent, this agency. It's going to need staff, though, significantly more staff than it has right now. And as it is now, it can respond, the Parliamentary Budget Office as it is now, however enfeebled, can respond to direct inquiries from members of Parliament. So somebody might say, hey, you know, how much, as they did in the last, a couple of MPs asked, how much are those new fighter jets really going to cost? And the Parliamentary Budget Office, with its limited resources, provided an answer that was pretty shocking. Now, under the new regime, independent MPs won't have that opportunity. They won't be able to ask questions. And the PBO can, you know, initiate inquiries, but it's going to have to get the approval of the speakers of both the House and the Senate, as you mentioned, and they have not necessarily been open to this kind of inquiry in the past. So two things are happening. The paddock gates have been thrown open in a way, but the horses' legs have been tied together. John, what's your assessment of the equine aspects of this, and whether or not the public will care to ride this horse?
I think, first of all, this is one of the most frightening metaphors I've ever seen on this panel, and we should just gallop away from it. But yeah, I certainly understand why the public gets cynical about politics, because this is politics at its most cynical. And I think it's why the Liberals are feeling so sensitive when they are accused of ramming an omnibus bill through the House of Commons. You know, as you point out, the Harper government created the Parliamentary Budget Officer. It seemed like a good idea at the time. And then the Parliamentary Budget Officer started offering opinions which contradicted those of the Finance Department and the Defence Department. And the Harper government started to do everything in its power to hobble the PBO, to shut it down. Failed only because of public outrage. And during all of this, the Liberals were saying, we need a truly independent officer of Parliament. We need a budget officer who will keep the government to account, who will help the opposition do their job. As soon as they get into power and the PBO starts contradicting the Finance Department and the Defence Department, they decide to, I think, hobble it. Basically, you can't do anything unless both speakers give you permission to. The Congressional Budget Office is one of the most valuable arms of the American government. For example, the health care bill that was defeated in Congress was defeated in part because the CBO came out with an independent costing of the measures and said they are nothing like what the administration says they are. And in fact, this measure will cost a great deal of money and strip a whole bunch of benefits away from millions of people. We need that kind of independence here in Parliament. We need a truly independent budget officer who has his own budget, who can investigate anything he wants, who can reach swift and reliable decisions on government measures, and who is accountable to no one other than the Canadian people. And that's what this legislation should do.